So now you can get started.
Okay, so I'm David Anthony Geary, visual artist, painter, printmaker, photographer, and dabbler of many other visual mediums. Yeah.
Cool. So we like to start our interviews with the first question. Are you hood grown? And if so, how does that influence your aesthetic?
Yes. So I was born south side Chicago. So in 77, we moved into the neighborhood that I grew up in. I was 2, and we were the first Black family on the block.
Oh, wow.
And inside of 10 years, I watched that neighborhood become a Black neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
I saw white flight firsthand. And I also saw the shift in the economics in the neighborhood and what it felt like to walk through the neighborhood, both positive and negative, right? There were aspects where we felt absolutely more comfortable. And then there was aspects where stuff got a little rougher,
mm-hmm.
depending on who was moving in. And then, so as a kid on the south side of Chicago who was fairly creative, I was the one that would lay in the hallway and just go through reams of paper
Mm-hmm.
that my mother would bring home. And literally go through paper, just drawing all day long. And eventually I took classes at the Art Institute. And so I would go downtown and take classes at the Art Institute, come back. And so I always loved to draw. But I never had any models of what it looked like to be an artist as a career.
Mm.
Right. So it was just something that I enjoyed doing. And I didn't, for any of my youth, all the way through high school, have any aspirations to be an artist. It wasn't until I moved to New Orleans for college where there was a switch that got flipped.
Mm-hmm.
And I met my mentor. And so when I moved to New Orleans, I also moved into the hood. I never lived on campus. And I lived just shy of Uptown. I had to pass through 2 projects to ride my bike through school. That was my world. And I was always inspired by both of those environments, the beauty and complexity of those, the people that I surrounded. So both communities, the community that I grew up in and then the one that I claimed as home later, were predominantly, if not completely, Black communities. And so that's always been my surroundings,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's reflected in any of the work of mine, particularly that is figurative.
Mm-hmm.
I paint the people around me.
Mm-hmm.
I draw the people around me. And it's not, for a long time, it wasn't something that I did conscientiously.
Mm.
It just was my world. And
Right.
so it was being a reflection of my world.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That is you're great with your answers. You said it was going to be long, but it was
Okay.
It was really concise. The story was all there. It was all needed. I got it.
Okay. I get a little rambly sometimes.
Yeah. So you mentioned how you love to draw. And I think that's how I was first kind of introduced to your work, is through your drawings.
Okay.
And you kind of have a signature style of drawing, and you're using circles and lines to define the features in people's faces and the figures you're drawing. How did you develop that style? What made you go that direction?
Yes. So the funny thing is I have yet to figure out what to call it.
Yeah, me either. That's why I did it.
It gets all of the wonderful nicknames, they are swirly doodles. I have gotten, someone came up with topographical portraiture.
Yes, it does remind me of topographical maps.
Right. And I was like, yo, that's kind of dope.
Mm-hmm.
But also a mouthful.
True.
So of the drawing exercises in my formal education, so I think that style comes out of my formal education. So it didn't really exist in my early drawings. So in my formal education, I was a bio-pre-med major who was like, I just got through talking about this because I did a talk with some former classmates. A group of us got together and did a talk. And, I was bio pre-med. I went to the school I went to because I wanted to be a shrink.
Oh.
So that was my life path, right? And it was there that I met my mentor in my first art class. And so I was like, I'm not taking art appreciation. Art appreciation is for suckers. I want a real art class, because that was the class non-art majors took.
Right.
And I was like, nah, I already appreciate art.
Yeah,
I would like
the easy class.
Right. I would like to learn something. And so I took drawing 1. And I took drawing 1 and 2D design at the same time. And so the man who eventually, John T. Scott, who eventually became my mentor, taught both of those classes. And one of the exercises that we would do were blind contour drawing.
Love a blind contour.
Right? I have a love-hate relationship with blind contour drawing.
I think everyone does. If you have like a really strong love for it, there's something wrong with you.
Right.
Like so, it's a struggle.
So I went through the process and I learned blind contour drawing, and and I loved the quality of line that method produced, right? Like not picking up my pencil and like searching for the figure in the line. But I was frustrated by the lack of accuracy that is, just normal because you're not looking at your paper. And so there's no way to be like truly accurate. You can, you can get it, but everybody looks a little wonky, no matter how good you are.
Yeah, and if it looks too good, you cheated.
Right. And so I started cheating.
Yeah.
But not as like for the class, I would do the exercises right. But then I wanted to figure out a way to like keep that quality, but access the accuracy that I was doing in this portrait work that I was painting, these portrait drawings. So I started, doing the same method, but I would just look back to refer. And then in mid-90s, I'd say mid-90s, 95, 96, which is around the same time that I changed my major. I had gotten an award and I bought what was called, it's this Artograph is this company that makes an opaque projector. So it was this big honking thing. It's like this big, but you could put your sketchbook on it and it would project big. And so I would take my little sketches and then project them and trace them. And so it increased both the fluidity of my line and the accuracy of the drawing. And so it's sort of like the back and forth between like the use of that technology and playing with like being as free as possible as I move through a line is where that comes from. And I didn't like dig in hard to it really until like 2013. It was real subtle until about 2013. And I had done it on accident with a Sharpie, well, on purpose, but later it was a bad mistake. Was I had done my underdrawing with a Sharpie. And I don't know if you know, Sharpie will bleed through paint. Yeah, and so it kept bleeding through.
So it's just like,
right. I was like, oh, you just refuse to not be seen. This pattern work that I've created just refused to not be seen. And I had a show and I had no more canvases. So I had to figure out a way to incorporate what was bleeding through into the piece. And so like, I'm a problem solver. And I just fell in love with the way it looked on the surface versus being a very subtle thing in the background. And so it started to push itself forward more and more in my work. And so since about 2012, 2013, it's become a very signature style of my work. Like you will rarely ever see a portrait of mine that doesn't have that in it.
Yeah. Going through your website now, it's like, that's all you see, which is beautiful. But can we also talk about your relationship to printmaking? So how do you work with your collage layers along with your print layers? You kind of do like these one-of-a-kind like mono prints, and you play around with print a lot. I love printmaking, so so I fell in love with the monotype in college. Got away, so I was away from printmaking for a long time.
because I didn't have access to,
Mm.
once I've graduated and then
Yeah, you don't have a print studio.
right,
What are you
right.
gonna
My
do?
studio was like a bedroom, and I would, if I needed a 2-bedroom apartment, I would have ran a 3-bedroom, and that would be my studio.
Right.
And so that was my life for a long time. And at some point or another, I came across this really cool book that was like about experimental printmaking. Let me see if I can find it. And in the back of the book was this thing called a gelatin plate, right? And so it was literally the recipe for Jell-O with like a third of the water that you would normally. So basically, you were making a Jell-O jiggler and rolling paint on it. So any water-based paint or ink would work. And you roll it on there and you press the piece of paper and it transfers like magically, just rubbing the surface. Like perfect transfers, like the way a press would give me. And I had already been doing monotypes with like cut paper and textured papers, like to press and lift ink, but I had to run them through a press. And so I had gotten away from that. And so I just started I made one of those plates. And at that time, the recipe required that you refrigerate the plate because it's literally just gelatin and water. And so I've got like 3 or 4 of them in the refrigerator, and I pull one out and work on it for an hour till it got a little too soft, and then stick it back in the refrigerator and pull another one out. And I was just like pages and pages and pages of just like color and texture and form. And I started cutting out figures more and just really pushing it, and went through like hundreds of pieces of paper, just figuring stuff out, like how this would work. And so I keep all of that. So, economical / hoardery. Like I keep all of those
artists have to be kind of hoarders. You got to hold on to materials.
And so that becomes visual information later. Those become papers that I cut up for collage. And so the reason that, so there are some of the printmaking pieces that are collage, and then there's some of them that are built through the use of cut paper as a stencil or a mask, and so they still look like collage, even though they have that aesthetic. Because I've always loved that 2D design. Everything was collage. We were figuring out how to build, how to create these illusions with these flat pieces of paper that we were cutting out. And a lot of my aesthetic is around problem solving, figuring out how to get to this sort of grayish, blurry idea that I have from whatever materials I have in front of me. And so now, fast forward, I have a recipe for a gelatin plate that is shelf stable. So now instead of a Jell-O jiggler, it's like a gummy bear.
Oh, okay.
Right? So it's literally like just a big flat gummy bear with no shelf. And it's technically edible, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Especially now that there's paint on there.
Right. Well, yes. Now, once you use it. There are now synthetic versions of it.
Oh, nice.
That have become popular in crafting circles. And I feel like this company, and I'm working on a proposal for them, is remiss in like marketing to the artist world.
Artists, right.
Right. Because they're like crafters and scrapbookers. That's who they market towards.
And there's a big divide between crafters and artists, and like,
which frustrates me.
It does, me too. Because
there's no difference.
There needs to be more of an overlap, because we're using similar materials, we're understanding space in a similar way. It's just that crafters may not draw nearly as much. That's pretty much like the big difference, I feel like.
And I know artists who don't ever draw anything.
Yeah, that's true too.
So like,
yeah, there should be a closer relationship.
I agree.
Yeah. So you have a mixed media painting series called Daisy Chain. Are you interested in the form or the history of the chain? I'm curious what drew you to that idea.
Yeah, so that's the piece that made me ask you. So
give me it all. I want to know.
So the Daisy Chain series is a bit of a double entendre. So seeing the chain or links, so you can tell by my work, I love circles or circular forms, right? And so I'm also very interested in connectivity. And so that's where the sort of chain or chain mail kind of aesthetic comes from. It comes from like figuring out a way to not figuratively, but or without like people, talk about these relationships of connectivity, right? And so each circle sort of represents an individual, right? And then the links where they connect to either one that connects to another, that connects to another, or they connect to multiples. The reason that it's a double entendre because it is also a sexual term, or a daisy chain, which is also what I'm talking about at the same time, right? So the work is at its core about connectivity, but there's also this very sensual sexual energy in it that is about the connectivity of pleasure, and whether it be in groups or individuals connected to one another, and how like love and our love lives and our sex lives are all very much connected. And so I'm talking about both, or exploring both of those things through the image of the chain or the chainmail.
Oh, cool. So how would you describe your color palette, especially how you reinvent skin tones with secondary and tertiary colors often?
Oh, say that word again for me, please.
Secondary and tertiary colors?
Tertiary. Nobody says tertiary.
Oh, I teach my students tertiary colors. They got to know.
I say tertiary and people look at me like I'm sharp, right?
Yeah, like, come on. You don't know about teal? Come on, about yellow, orange? Yeah. Come on.
Well, they know.
They know what they are.
But they don't know the word.
Yeah.
It just confuses people. But I appreciate that. So the root of my color theory is a soft split complement color theory. So if I don't like complementary colors, I'm usually messing with just off to the side, which usually throws me into the tertiary colors. And those are the ones that I tend to be drawn to anyway. So when I was in college, I had an adjunct professor who was not a regular professor at our school, in a painting class, referred to my palette as Crayola. Yeah, right? So, but I was David, and I was like, oh, thank you. Yeah, that's pretty much like I take the colors straight out the tubes. Because I was like I would get a chunk, I would sell a painting, and I would go down the aisle and just pick all of the colors that I wanted. And the mixing that would happen back then was on the canvas. I wasn't pre-mixing. I would find the colors that I wanted, and then when they run into each other, they would mix. But otherwise, like as they are, it was pure, it was vibrant, like high chroma. And my work stayed like that for a long time, up until 2005. And then the 2005-06, I did one of my last like super vibrant series about the Katrina experience. So that's when I came back to Chicago. And then, the gray of Chicago started to creep into my work. And my palette got more, and still like similar color theories, but just less saturated. It got less and less saturated over time. And I would say that 2018, 17, I started yearning for color again. So 2015, I got divorced. My whole world flips upside down, and then my palette also started to shift back into this other vibrant space. I don't know what that says. I'm not in.
You were almost a shrink. How do you not know?
Right.
You do know what that means.
I just don't be wanting to say those things out loud.
I feel you. Don't put in the ethos. It's not real if you don't talk about it.
Right. I know. Or as a friend of mine famously said, the universe don't know when you playing.
That's a good one. I haven't heard that one before.
Be careful what you say.
Yeah, that's true. So kind of speaking about your kind of gray tones when you were working in that. You have a beautiful portrait series entitled The Great Migration Portfolio.
Yes.
And you talk about the conceptual connection you see between Black people and blackbirds, crows, and ravens.
Mhm.
Can you talk about that connection?
Yeah, absolutely. So that series came out of an investigation of the Great Migration,
Mm-hmm.
right? As a piece of American history, um, and trying to find like what was my place in that, right? So the year that I did that was the centennial for the Great Migration. So the agreed upon start date for the Great Migration is 1916. So 2016,
Mm-hmm.
the city Chicago is one of the centers of which the first wave of the Great Migration really impacted.
Mm-hmm.
And so 2016, they wanted to do a big centennial thing. And so I had this idea, investigate this series, figure out like my personal relationship to it. And so this, migration immediately, like I'm always dissecting things. And so migration immediately brought to me this thought about birds and migratory patterns and this whole, we think about birds flying south for the winter, but that means to do that, that means they have to fly north
Eventually, yeah.
Right. So there are these cycles of migration. And then secondarily, birds in general, well, there's a rich mythology around like blackbirds and their power and ominous in both indigenous and African folklore, which I was drawn to. But also birds in general are sort of a universal symbol of freedom.
Mm.
Because they move about the world in a way that no other animal does, right? They don't have the restrictions. They can fly over bodies of water that we can't get across without technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so they aren't restricted in their movement in the way that the rest of us land mammals are. And so they sort of became avatars for all of the people who, during this piece of historical transition, are moving. The birds become avatars for them. And so as the series progressed, they got more and more defined and articulated. And so you notice in some of the pieces, the birds are like full and have personalities. In others, they're more symbolic. Or just the idea of a bird, like a silhouette, so even though when you look through the portfolio, it's not presented chronologically in how I finished it, you can tell like where the ideas I pushed more and more. So I did that over the course of about 6 months. And it's almost 100 works in total.
Yeah, it's a big,
yeah, it's crazy.
Big collection. It's beautiful though.
It was an ambitious moment of mine.
Mm-hmm. You love those ambitious projects.
Yeah.
So you have a piece called "We Are the Revolution Personified," and it depicts women of the Black Panther Party, as it was a celebration of the founding of the party when you put it out. Why do you believe these are the key figures of the party? Why didn't you choose to put any men in this image?
Okay. It's everything's got layers. It's just,
physically there's layers in your work, and conceptually there's layers.
So, I got asked so that was a piece. I don't generally paint people I don't know.
Okay.
All of the works post 1997 that are of someone that I do not know personally are historical pieces. Those are the only, so that's kind of my rule. Like if we haven't done this in some way, these days I've made room for the digital discourse. But we've exchanged in some way or another because I get to know that person and it becomes a part of the work. That becomes a part of the work that I'm creating. So I got asked to be in the exhibition that was in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panther Party. I was asked like, what I asked, what do you guys looking for? What are you thinking about? And they said, well, we want something that for you says like the strength and foundation of the Black Panther Party. And we don't want to tell you any more than that. And I was like, cool, that's perfect. And I was like, all right, who the top sisters? And it was really that simple, because, you know, there's an undercurrent that doesn't get talked about in a lot of conversations about civil rights activism, whether it was on the Black Panther side, the Martin Luther King side, the Malcolm X side, is that the power of women in all of those movements was always overshadowed by the front men, right? But in every one of those movements, the women are integral and essential into making them function. Yep. They are very often the writers behind a lot of the speeches. They are very often the support systems that allow these men to be able to go out into the world, because it's a time when that kind of conversation from women just wouldn't be accepted, right? And so like it's complex in to be able to talk about, like, these are women who pushed, particularly those three, so Angela Davis, Kathleen Cleaver, and Elaine Brown, are women who pushed out to the front, even though they were not the kind of recognition like Eldridge Cleaver and you know, Fred Hampton.
Yeah, I know, like Kathleen Cleaver, I mean, I'm a big fan of her just because like she ended up being a professor, like she was just like on her shit, and her husband like got all of the praise, but like low key, he did not do nearly as much as her.
No, well, because we, you know, and it's a really interesting thing, because it is always a lot of what was happening during that time is that, you know, there's women liberations and equal rights acts that are happening at the same time. And so in the Black community, particularly, there became this like, you have to pick your fight.
And as Black women, what are you supposed to do?
Like how you pick a fight that you are, you know,
a part of both.
You're right. like no, I can't help the party if you don't get your foot off my neck. The same way, and like as a Black man, for me, like, it's frustrating when other men don't get it, particularly men of color, because we sit at an intersection that very few people sit at, and it is an intersection of privilege and oppression. Right? That should make it really easy to understand anybody else's privilege and oppression. Because
white women would have the same kind of understanding, but they don't.
Right, but I can't speak to the, you know, because different experiences. Right, but Black men and white women have, you know, there's this, like, I walk around all day in all of the male privilege. There's stuff I just don't have to think about. Right, but I am also at the same time in the same skin, in the same walking around in under the oppression of Blackness in this country. And so, like, that intersection, like, forces me, I think, in the work that I do, very subconsciously, because it's not like I have a message, I am going to say these things. It just becomes a part of how I operate, and so it just kind of comes out in the work. I've been told by a couple of folks that I have this this just unending love for Black women that is clearly apparent in my work. And I was like, yeah, you know, like, I was the weird kid, so like I didn't kick it with my dad and my brother as much as I kicked it with my mother, my grandmothers, and my aunt, because like I didn't do all of the boy stuff. Right, like I didn't play the sports balls. Like, those were not interesting to me. I was much more interested in, like, being in the kitchen. I mean, like, I tapped into a lot of that, the other male stuff, but I spent a lot of my energy around the women in my life. And so while I had, you know, really good male role models in my life, my energy has always been geared towards feminine energy in my surroundings, in the space that I feel most comfortable. And so it also comes out in the work. And so I was immediately drawn to do the women of the party. And I love that because like nobody was in that show.
Yeah.
Like,
so it was standing out even more.
Yeah, I was just like, oh, and the world is still the same. I was like, if I see another Fred Hampton, like, how many? That's why I don't paint famous people generally.
Yeah, it's just too
because
many.
I'm like I don't need to see any more. Portraits.
Or Tupac.
Portraits.
Or Basquiat's.
Right, like stop.
I mean, they're influential. Yeah, we had a lot more. So I've noticed recently that you started to make some art digitally.
Yes.
And so can we talk about your relationship to line and mark making and how like creating digital artwork has changed your way of thinking or transitioned or transferred very easily?
It's we like 17 thoughts just ran through my head right when you like all at the same time. So technology has always been a part, for a long time, been a part of my practice. I've always been fascinated when like art history discovers the use of technology in art in the older generations of art, you know, in all of the European masters and like how they were all using lenses and camera technology before there were cameras.
Right.
But lens technology and the way light works to be able to make this communication of a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface feel relatable in a different way than we had been doing prior to those, you know, I think it's China. It was like the first camera. It was a camera obscura, and it was literally a tent.
Yeah, it was huge, and there's the tiny little hole.
Right.
Light.
And so and it's a movie playing on, but it's just the world that's outside, right? And you know, those are ancient, and so like I've always been drawn to stuff like that. The switching to digital is literally that same kind of a world. It's a light box, right, that I get to draw on top of. I have added certain things that make it feel more like the analog world. Like I have a special screen protector on my iPad that gives it texture.
Oh, it feels more like paper.
So it feels like paper. When I first came, I was like, oh, because it was weird.
Yeah.
Because you're drawing with like this plastic stylus on a piece of glass.
Yeah.
And it doesn't feel anything like drawing because it does, you know. And I stayed away from, like early on in it, I stayed away from like any of the paintbrushy kind of things. I stuck with the stuff that felt like a pencil because it was the most true like connection. But I then went out and started to explore more and play. It makes it easier for me to play with the relationship between my photography and my painting. Because I can just import one of my photographs and literally draw directly on top of that.
Oh, nice.
And so it allows me to play in a certain kind of way that would be
with
harder.
The layers?
Yes, that would be harder, not impossible, but it would just be a lot more work to do in the physical world. The ability to undo things, I love. Yeah, you know, but like it can spoil you. Because
you're a problem solver in real life. So then you're like, when you get back to the real life, you're like, ooh, I can't undo.
No, I cannot undo that. There's no double tapping to go back. That stroke is there. Now, what are you going to do to deal with it? And so I go back and forth, but I think I still communicate roughly the same way. But I try to, in the digital world, use things that feel digital that I wouldn't necessarily do. So I may be using a kind of mark making that plays with the fact that this is a light box rather than a flat surface that I'm adding pigment to.
Yeah, your digital work has a glow to it. Like it's clear that you're like using that.
That's what I'm interested in, because you know, painting like that, while it is possible.
Yeah.
That's like me and like hyperrealism. Like I love it. It's beautiful. I have no desire to do it.
Feel you.
I'm just like, no, I can take a picture.
Yeah.
Pretty decent photographer.
Yeah.
Like, I can take a picture.
Oh.
My paintings, I want to look like paintings. Yeah.
I get that. So thank you so much for talking with me for all this time. I really appreciate it. I've been following your Instagram for a while, so like I'm happy to finally talk to you. Can you tell the people what's next for your work, maybe if you're working on any project, and where they can find you on the interweb?
So to find me on the interwebs, everything is David Anthony Art.
I love that. We love nice condensed branding. This is what we do.
So the website, davidanthonyart.com. My Instagram is @DavidAnthonyArt. Facebook is David Anthony Art. I am maxed out on friends, but you can follow me, or you can go to my professional page and follow there. Instagram is my hub. So everything kind of comes out of Instagram. So what's next for me is I've been obsessed with these babies.
Your plants?
Yeah, so it's
like I know you're a plant dad. I'm very appreciative of it.
Crazy. It's
yes.
They're all over. Like wait, I'm gonna flip. Can I flip this? How do I flip this screen?
Are you using okay. Oh yeah, you have lots of plants.
Right, like it's ridiculous.
I feel you. No, my whole window back here is covered with plants. So
so this window used to be, but I just redecorated it, and I'm like, I need something new in that window. So
yeah, so more plants. More plants.
Right, more plants. It's
more plants.
I've got like 120 plants in there.
Oh wow. Yeah. I feel that though. I have a lot of plants, so I don't know if I have over 100, but I definitely have probably 60 at this point. Yeah.
I'm in this space of okay, let me get some artwork in here before I get any more plants.
Yeah, and then you can continue your jungle.
Right. Because I feel like I'm at this space where okay, I need to get more surfaces to put things on and have some artwork in place. So I'm working on this series. I was working on this series, and then the coronavirus was like, nah, son, you can't go to the studio no more.
So you're just making at home now, or are you?
Yeah. So I'm in a position where I'm not pressed to make.
Okay.
So I've done a few corporate things in the last I'd say 6 months to a year that have given me a little bit of cushion. So I'm I'm okay. So I'm not pressed to make. And I feel like this is why I laugh at human beings, right? We make reasons for everything. I'm like, see, this had to happen. But I was gonna rush this series. So I was working on this series called In My Garden. And it's the relationship between people and plants. And so I'm pairing portraits of people that I have known forever, or have just come to know, who inspire me. All of the beautiful people in my world, with all the plants in my world. And so I want to do this whole series of portraits that will eventually culminate in an exhibition that also has plants.
Oh, that would be beautiful.
And so I want to set up a whole little station that's kind of like my living room. People can do selfies with all of the plants and artwork, and then I want to do custom pots.
Oh, that'd be so cool.
With plants in them that are also purchasable, as well as the paintings and drawings that I'm going to be doing. And so that's what's up on the wall in the studio currently. And then this kind of hit. And so I've been playing around with some sketches and some ideas for it still, but that's what's next.
That's exciting. I'm excited for that project. As a plant lover and plant mom, I'm like, oh yeah.
Yeah. Part of me wants to be is this because Afrofuturism is all of the rage right now. I want to be this is Afro botanicalism.
I like that term. Let's make it a hashtag. Make it happen.
Right, Afro-botanical.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I'm going to stop the recording. I appreciate you.